Welcome to the War Archive, where wars become stories. In 1974, one of the world's oldest empires didn't fall to an invading army. It fell to a song on the radio. A revolution of flowers in Europe was born from three forgotten wars in Africa. The morning light over the Tagus River carries a quiet melancholy, its surface reflecting the ghosts of ships that once carried Portugal's ambitions to every corner of the world. For centuries, those waters were the veins of empire, but by the 20th century, they had become the mire of decline. Portugal, once a maritime superpower, had built a world on maps and faith. Its explorers had linked oceans, charted continents, and claimed to civilize the tropics under the banner of the cross. But by the 1900s, the empire had withered into fragments. Territories scattered across Africa and Asia, ruled from a homeland that was itself poor and weary. On paper, Lisbon still commanded lands across four continents: Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, Cape Verde, Goa, Macau, and East Timor. But in reality, these were remnants of a world that no longer existed. In the heart of Europe, Portugal stood still while the world moved forward. It was the poorest country in Western Europe, ruled by Antonio de Oliveira Salazar, a quiet, devout economist who built the Estado Novo, or New State, in 1933. His regime preached obedience, austerity, and faith. He wrapped the nation in the language of discipline and tradition, convincing his people that poverty was not a curse, but a form of virtue. To be humble was to be holy, and to serve the empire was to serve God. Salazar's government claimed Portugal was not a colonial power, but a pluricontinental nation, a single soul stretching from Lisbon to Luanda, from Porto to Maputo. The idea was powerful, even poetic, a small European state that imagined itself eternal through the illusion of geography. Yet the truth beneath was bitter. Portugal's colonies existed not as partners, but as plantations. The wealth of Africa flowed north to Lisbon, while the Africans themselves remained voiceless, bound to forced labor and racial hierarchies masked as brotherhood. While other empires faded after World War II, Portugal doubled down on its myths. London left India, Paris left Algeria, Brussels left Congo, but Lisbon stayed behind, convinced that it alone still carried the civilizing mission of the West. Schools taught that the Portuguese were a chosen people, gentle, faithful, and uniquely capable of bringing order to the tropics. In reality, Portugal's power was crumbling beneath the weight of time and denial. By the late 1950s, the world was changing faster than Salazar's Portugal could comprehend. Across Africa, nationalist movements were rising. The United Nations spoke of independence as a human right. Even within Lisbon, whispers of discontent began to spread among students, intellectuals, and young soldiers. The empire was no longer a source of pride. It had become a burden that Portugal could barely afford to carry. Then, in December 1961, the illusion of eternity finally cracked. On the far side of the Indian Ocean, Indian troops marched into Goa, Daman, and Diu, Portugal's oldest possessions in Asia. The garrison fought briefly, hopelessly, and surrendered. For the first time in centuries, Lisbon lost a piece of its empire not through diplomacy, but through defeat. The regime called it temporary occupation, but the world called it liberation. For Salazar, Goa's loss was unthinkable. He refused to recognize it, declaring that Goa remains Portuguese in spirit. Newspapers were forbidden from printing the truth, and radio broadcasts filled the silence with hymns of patriotism. But beneath the censorship, something had shifted. Portugal had been exposed as fragile, its authority broken by a reality it could no longer deny. As the empire's oldest jewel fell, another storm gathered in Africa. In the red dust of Angola, in the plantations of Baixa de Cassange, in the restless cities of Luanda and Lourenço Marques, the seeds of revolt began to take root. The coming decade would see the empire's heartlands turned into battlefields, its myths tested against the weight of history, and its soldiers sent to fight not for conquest, but for survival. Portugal's empire had outlived its century. Now it would face the one truth Salazar's regime could never control: the truth that no nation can rule forever by pretending time has stopped. The Estado Novo, Salazar's new state, was not sustained by force alone. It survived through faith, fear, and a powerful story. Salazar believed that nations could be frozen in time, preserved through discipline and obedience. He was not a general, but a scholar, an economist who ruled like a monk, convinced that austerity and silence could protect Portugal from the storms of modernity. The result was a country wrapped in ritual, where parades replaced debate and where devotion replaced progress. His Portugal was a society of quiet streets and loud sermons. The church sanctified submission, teaching that authority was divine and hierarchy was holy. Newspapers printed what the government approved. Radios played patriotic hymns between speeches that praised God, the fatherland, and the empire. Order and morality became the nation's creed, and the price of peace was paralysis. But behind the calm exterior, Salazar built something far more enduring than censorship. He built a mythology. Portugal, he claimed, was not an empire with colonies, but a single pluricontinental nation, a body stretching across oceans and races. In this vision, Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau were not conquered lands but extensions of Portugal's own soul. This ideology made rebellion not just treason, it made it blasphemy. To justify its rule abroad, the regime embraced a theory called Lusotropicalism. First imagined by Brazilian sociologist Gilberto Freire, it claimed that the Portuguese were uniquely suited to the tropics because they were tolerant, adaptable, and racially inclusive. Unlike the British or French, the story went, the Portuguese did not exploit. They assimilated. It was a seductive lie. In practice, Portugal's empire was built on labor camps, economic monopolies, and racial division. Africans were classified as civilized or uncivilized, their rights determined by how well they conformed to Portuguese culture. Education was reserved for a small elite, and entire communities were forced into cotton and coffee production for the benefit of Lisbon's merchants. In Angola and Mozambique, forced labor, chibalo, remained a state policy well into the 1960s. To maintain this system, Salazar relied on his secret weapon, the PAID, the political police. It was the silent heart of the Estado Novo. The PAID's reach extended from the slums of Lisbon to the jungles of Africa, recording every whisper and punishing every doubt. Suspected nationalists, students, priests, even soldiers disappeared into cells without trial. Fear became as common as bread. Abroad, Salazar portrayed Portugal as a moral fortress of the West, a small, faithful ally defending Christian civilization from communism. In the Cold War, this argument worked. NATO needed Portugal's ports, especially the Azores, for its Atlantic strategy. Western allies turned a blind eye to the empire's brutality in exchange for geopolitical convenience. At home, the illusion of unity began to fray. The younger generation of officers, those who had studied abroad, who read banned books, who dreamed of a modern Portugal, started to question the logic of eternal empire. Why was a small, poor nation sacrificing its youth to hold territories half a world away? Why must progress mean loyalty, and loyalty mean silence? Salazar never allowed these questions to surface. He ruled through the stillness of fear, through the monotony of obedience. But when illness struck him in 1968, the spell began to weaken. His successor, Marcelo Caetano, promised evolution within continuity, but it was the same doctrine wrapped in softer words. The new state endured, but its foundation, the belief that ideology could replace reality, was beginning to crumble. Beyond the borders of Portugal, the colonies waited in restless quiet. The ideology that had protected the empire for decades would soon collide with something it could not contain, the will of people who no longer believed in the stories told about them. The empire's faith would soon meet its reckoning, not in words, but in fire. The first real blow to Salazar's empire came not from revolution, but from humiliation. In December 1961, India reclaimed Goa, Daman, and Diu, Portugal's oldest territories in Asia. For centuries, Lisbon had called Goa the Jewel of the East, proof that its empire was eternal. But when Indian forces surrounded the enclave, the Portuguese garrison, isolated and outnumbered, faced the impossible. Salazar ordered them to fight to the last man, yet the local commander chose surrender over slaughter. Within 2 days, 400 years of empire vanished. To the world, the event was inevitable. To Portugal, it was a wound. Salazar refused to acknowledge the loss, declaring Goa temporarily occupied. His censors erased the headlines. His radio filled the silence with patriotic hymns. But the truth leaked home through sailors, letters, and whispers. The illusion of permanence had been broken. If Goa could fall, what of Africa? In Angola, the question was already being answered. In the vast plantations of Baixa de Cassanje, African laborers, forced to harvest cotton under brutal conditions, rose in protest in January 1961. They demanded fair pay and dignity. The colonial administration responded with machine guns and napalm. Villages burned, thousands were killed, and the massacre spread fury across the land. What began as a labor strike became a movement for independence. Across Angola, nationalist groups emerged: the MPLA, FNLA, and UNITA, each with its own vision for freedom, divided by tribe, ideology, and foreign influence. Lisbon labeled them bandits, but the truth was far deeper. The empire's subjects were no longer asking for reform, they were demanding life on their own terms. The rebellion in Angola sent tremors through the rest of the Portuguese colonies. In Mozambique, students, farmers, and exiles began organizing under a new banner: Frelimo, the Mozambique Liberation Front. In Guinea-Bissau, the agronomist Amilcar Cabral founded the PAIGC, a movement that saw education as vital as warfare. Cabral taught that to fight for freedom is to fight for the right to be oneself, a philosophy that would turn the small colony into one of the most disciplined revolutionary theaters in Africa. Portugal's response was swift and absolute. Salazar ordered mass mobilization. For the first time since the Napoleonic Wars, Portugal sent its sons across oceans to fight. The docks of Belém filled with conscripts, farm boys, students, and laborers, boarding troop ships with rifles in hand and fear in their eyes. They were told they were defending civilization. Most had never seen a map of where they were going. As the ships left Lisbon's harbor, the church bells rang and families waved from the quay, but beneath the anthems there was unease. The soldiers were going not to expand an empire, but to preserve its ghost. In the jungles of Angola and Mozambique, they would soon learn that the sun no longer rose for Portugal's glory. It rose for survival. Back home, the regime framed the conflict as a test of faith. It called the wars a luta contra o terrorismo, the fight against terrorism, and promised that Portugal would never abandon its historic mission. But beneath the propaganda, exhaustion crept in. The empire had survived centuries of storms, yet now it faced one it could neither reason with nor repress: the storm of modern history. The fall of Goa had been a symbolic loss. The uprisings in Africa would be something far more dangerous, a war of attrition that Lisbon's ideology could not win. As the decade turned, the empire was already bleeding, and the soil of Angola would soon become the first battlefield in Portugal's long, painful farewell to empire. Angola was the empire's crown jewel, vast, resource-rich, and deeply divided. It was also the first to erupt into open war. When rebellion spread across the country in 1961, Portugal believed it was facing a small uprising. What it actually faced was the beginning of the end. The first strikes and riots around Luanda quickly escalated into massacres on both sides. The Portuguese army, caught unprepared, responded with overwhelming force. Villages were destroyed, fields scorched, and civilians driven into the bush. The regime called it pacification. The world called it brutality. Three movements soon defined the Angolan struggle. The MPLA, led by Agostinho Neto, was Marxist in ideology and sought a secular Pan-African Angola. The FNLA, backed by Zaire and the United States, was more tribal and conservative, rooted in the Bakongo people of the north. And then there was UNITA, formed later under Jonas Savimbi, which blended nationalism with rural populism. Together they hated Portuguese rule, but they distrusted one another even more. Portugal responded with military modernization. Conscripts were shipped from Lisbon to Luanda, trained in counterinsurgency, and told they were defending the West from communism. Helicopters and armored vehicles filled the airfields, and foreign advisors whispered strategies modeled on the wars in Algeria and Vietnam. The jungle, however, belonged to the guerrillas. They struck from nowhere, vanished into villages, and reappeared across the border. The Portuguese army could win battles, but it could not hold the peace. The early 1960s became a cycle of raids, reprisals, and rumors. Operations like Viriato and No Gordio tried to cut off the rebels' supply lines, but the fighting only spread. Angola became a war without front lines, a war of roads and rivers, of patrols that never saw the enemy. For every rebel killed, another seemed to rise from the dust. The more Portugal fought to preserve its empire, the more the world saw the futility of the effort. Lisbon tried to rebrand its rule as benevolent. Propaganda films showed Portuguese teachers smiling beside African children, new roads being built, and flags raised under bright sun. But behind those images lay fear and exhaustion. The African population, forced into strategic villages, lived under military control. The soldiers themselves, often teenagers, wrote letters home describing heat, malaria, and the sound of unseen gunfire every night. "We live in silence," one conscript wrote, "waiting for an enemy that is everywhere and nowhere." By the late 1960s, Angola had become the bleeding heart of Portugal's empire. The fighting drained the treasury, consumed the youth, and eroded faith in the Estado Novo's promises. The war was no longer about winning, it was about not admitting defeat. For every general who declared victory, another province rose in revolt. And as the guerrillas gained international support from the Soviet Union, China, Cuba, and newly independent African nations, Portugal found itself more isolated than ever before. To the world, Angola had become a microcosm of colonial collapse. To Lisbon, it remained a holy mission, but to the young soldiers who trudged through its jungles, it was neither, it was simply survival. The empire was dying, not with a final battle, but with a slow, quiet bleed across red earth. If Angola was the empire's open wound, Mozambique was its fever, slow, spreading, and impossible to cure. The colony stretched along Africa's eastern coast, vast and diverse, from the Zambezi River to the Indian Ocean. For centuries, it had been Portugal's gateway to the east, a land of sugar, cotton, and gold mines. But by the early 1960s, it had also become a land of silence and resentment. Africans were denied land ownership, forced into labor contracts, and treated as foreigners in their own country. The empire called them assimilated subjects, yet even those who spoke perfect Portuguese could never be equals. In 1962, exiled nationalists and students gathered in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, and formed the Frelimo, the Frente de Libertação de Moçambique. Under the leadership of Eduardo Mondlane, a U.S.-educated sociologist, Frelimo envisioned more than independence. It wanted to build a new kind of nation, one defined not by race or tribe, but by unity and education. Mondlane believed revolution should begin with literacy and dignity, not terror. "The fight," he wrote, "is not only against Portugal, it is against ignorance." When peaceful appeals failed, Frelimo turned to armed struggle. On September 25, 1964, guerrillas launched their first attacks in the northern province of Cabo Delgado, striking police outposts and communication lines. Portugal dismissed it as banditry, but within a year the insurgency had spread across the north. The terrain favored the rebels, dense forests, rivers, and hidden paths connecting villages sympathetic to their cause. Portugal responded with the same tactics it had used in Angola: mass mobilization, forced relocations, and a brutal counterinsurgency campaign. Entire communities were moved into aldeamentos, fortified strategic hamlets surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. Officially, they were meant to protect civilians from Frelimo's influence. In reality, they were prisons without walls. Families were uprooted, fields left untended, and hunger followed wherever the army went. By 1968, Samora Machel, a former nurse and guerrilla commander, had taken leadership after Mondlane's assassination in a parcel bomb. Under Machel, Frelimo hardened into a military machine. The movement's camps became schools, hospitals, and training centers supported by China, the Soviet Union, and Tanzania. Each success drew more recruits, not only from Mozambique, but from across Africa, where Frelimo's struggle became a symbol of defiance against the last European empire. Portugal's army adapted, forming elite units like the Flechas, African trackers trained by the secret police, and deploying helicopter squadrons to chase guerrillas through the forest. Yet every tactical victory seemed hollow. The war consumed enormous resources, draining Lisbon's economy and morale. At home, propaganda still insisted that Mozambique was at peace. In truth, the colony was burning. For the soldiers, Mozambique was a place of contradictions. They patrolled through paradise, green mountains, endless coastlines, and star-filled skies. Yet every step carried fear. They did not know if the next village would offer food or bullets. Letters from home spoke of empty shelves, rising prices, and forgotten promises. What had begun as a campaign of pride had become an exercise in endurance. By the early 1970s, the war's brutality reached its zenith. Reports of massacres began to surface despite censorship. The most infamous came in Wiriamu, where in December 1972, Portuguese paratroopers killed hundreds of civilians suspected of aiding Frelimo. Missionaries smuggled the story to Europe, and when it reached the Times of London in 1973, the world reacted with horror. Lisbon denied everything, but the damage was done. For Portugal, Wiriamu was more than a scandal. It was the collapse of its moral armor. The Estado Novo had long justified its empire as a mission of civilization. Now it was branded as an empire of murder. And as Mozambique burned, even loyal officers began to doubt what they were fighting for. The jungles of the north became both battlefield and burial ground for the Portuguese dream. From the smoke of Wiriamu rose a realization that no amount of discipline, faith, or denial could save the empire. The myth of eternal Portugal was dying in the tropics, and with it, the last illusions of the old world. Compared to Angola or Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau seemed insignificant, a humid, low-lying strip of West Africa with no gold, no oil, and few roads. To Lisbon, it was an afterthought, a forgotten post held more for pride than profit. Yet here, in the swamps and forests of this neglected colony, Portugal would face a kind of war it could neither understand nor win. In 1956, agronomist Amilcar Cabral founded the PAIC, the Partido Africano para a Independência da Guiné e Cabo Verde. Cabral was unlike other revolutionaries. He fought with ideas as much as with rifles. The weapon of theory, he said, is as necessary as the weapon of the gun. He taught that true liberation required education, self-respect, and unity across tribes. His followers built schools and clinics in secret while preparing for armed struggle. By 1963, after peaceful protests were crushed, Cabral ordered the first attacks on Portuguese positions. Guerrillas struck at night and melted into the mangroves before dawn. Portugal dismissed them as bandits, but within a few years, the PAIC controlled much of the countryside. What made their movement different was its discipline. Fighters were instructed to treat civilians with dignity, to teach as they liberated. "Kill one soldier," Cabral said, "and you remove a man. Build one school, and you destroy ignorance for generations." Lisbon poured in thousands of troops, supported by gunboats and aircraft. Yet the terrain defeated technology. Helicopters could not see through the canopy. Trucks sank into mud. Every patrol felt like a march into quicksand. The army responded with fortified bases and brutal reprisals, but each act of violence drove more villagers to the rebels. By the late 1960s, Guinea-Bissau had become Portugal's most costly and demoralizing front. The PAIC expanded with help from the Soviet bloc, training, weapons, and the new Strela II missiles that finally challenged Portugal's control of the skies. For the first time, the empire's helicopters fell from the air. The myth of Portuguese invulnerability collapsed along with them. Cabral's charisma drew attention far beyond Africa. He became a global symbol of intellectual revolution, admired by Che Guevara and Nkrumah alike. In 1970, Portugal launched Operation Green Sea, a daring amphibious assault on Conakry in neighboring Guinea, aiming to kidnap Cabral and destroy PAIGC headquarters. The raid failed. Cabral survived, and his movement emerged stronger than before. But fate would claim him soon after. He was assassinated in 1973, killed by his own comrades, manipulated by colonial intelligence. His death could have shattered the cause, yet it only deepened its resolve. That same year, the PAIC declared independence in the liberated village of Boé. They established schools, hospitals, and local councils, an entire government in the jungle. The world recognized their sovereignty even before Lisbon did. By then, Portuguese soldiers knew the war was lost. They patrolled empty roads, guarding an empire that existed only on paper. For Portugal, Guinea-Bissau was a paradox, a colony of little value that carried immense consequence. It drained men, money, and morale, teaching young officers an unbearable truth. No amount of faith or force could preserve a dying empire. Many of those officers would soon return home disillusioned, carrying with them the seeds of revolution. By the late 1960s, the Estado Novo had turned its empire into a machine of surveillance and survival. It was a system that ran on fear, efficiency, and exhaustion, a toolkit of control designed to keep distant wars alive long after purpose had died. To Lisbon, it was the embodiment of order. To those who lived beneath it, it was a labyrinth of cages. Portugal's army had evolved into a force both modern and desperate. Thousands of conscripts, many barely out of school, were sent to Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea. They were told they were defending the West from communism, that their service was a duty of faith. To fight guerrillas, the military abandoned traditional fortresses and built networks of forward bases, small, isolated outposts connected by airlifts and dirt roads. Helicopters became the empire's lifeline, carrying troops across jungles and deserts. "We live by the rotor," one soldier wrote, "and die when it stops." But firepower alone could not tame rebellion. So Lisbon tried to control what it could: the population. The army created thousands of aldeamentos, fortified strategic hamlets, where civilians were forcibly relocated under military supervision. Officially, they were meant to protect villagers from insurgents. In practice, they were tools of control. Families were uprooted from ancestral lands, crammed behind barbed wire, and forced to depend on army rations. Fields withered, traditions vanished, and resentment grew in silence. In the cities, the PIDE, Portugal's secret police, monitored everything from letters to sermons. Informants were everywhere: priests, traders, and even teachers. Anyone suspected of sympathy with the nationalists could vanish overnight. The prisons of Tarrafal and Lourenço Marques filled with poets, students, and soldiers who had spoken one word too many. Fear was no longer an emotion. It was a way of life. Lisbon's propaganda painted a different picture. Newsreels showed happy farmers waving Portuguese flags, mixed-race children singing the national anthem, and new schools rising under the African sun. The narrative was clear. Portugal was not an occupier, but a family. Yet outside these images, the countryside burned. Each liberated village was another wound, each success another illusion. To combat guerrilla tactics, the army recruited Africans into special units like the flechas, the arrows. Trained by the PIDE, they were trackers who could move silently through forests, blending in with the terrain. Some fought for survival, others for revenge, and many out of necessity. Their existence blurred the line between loyalty and survival. By 1970, Lisbon's military machine was technically efficient but spiritually hollow. The army held the cities, ports, and highways, but it did not control the night. When darkness fell, the guerrillas owned the land. Villages that sang patriotic songs by day whispered freedom by firelight. The empire's victories were measured not in ground gained, but in months survived. Each cleared zone would fall again within weeks. The generals in Lisbon claimed progress. The soldiers in the field counted days until rotation. Portugal was winning every battle and losing the war. The Estado Novo had built a system to preserve itself: bases, hamlets, and shadows. But its greatest enemy was no longer Frelimo or the MPLA. It was fatigue. Beneath the discipline and propaganda, a quiet truth was spreading through the ranks. This war had no end, and no meaning left to give it one. It began as a whisper, the kind of story soldiers told each other in hushed tones, just another raid in a remote Mozambican village. But by 1973, that whisper had become a roar that no amount of censorship could silence. The name was Wiriamu, and it would burn through Portugal's last shred of moral credibility. In December 1972, Portuguese paratroopers entered the village of Wiriamu near Tete. They had been told that guerrillas were hiding there, that every hut concealed an enemy. What followed was not a battle, but a massacre. Hundreds of men, women, and children were rounded up, shot, or burned alive in their homes. The soldiers left nothing but ash. The official report described a successful counterinsurgency operation, but survivors told a different story, one of slaughter. For months, silence held. The PIDE destroyed reports, censored letters, and threatened witnesses. Yet truth has a way of finding air. A group of Spanish missionaries who had lived in the area smuggled their testimonies out of Mozambique. In July 1973, as Prime Minister Marcelo Caetano prepared for a diplomatic visit to London, the Times of London published the story. Portuguese troops massacre hundreds of villagers, the headline read. The effect was immediate and devastating. The world condemned Portugal as a pariah. Governments demanded investigations, the Vatican voiced outrage, and even NATO allies recoiled. Lisbon denied everything, claiming it was a communist fabrication. Caetano insisted that the Portuguese army did not commit atrocities, but denial only deepened the shame. For the first time, the regime's myth of the civilizing mission was dead in the eyes of the world. Inside Portugal, the story spread quietly despite censorship. People whispered the name Wiriamu in cafes, on buses, in university dorms. For soldiers still fighting in Mozambique, it struck like a blow. They had been told they were defending civilization. Now they saw themselves cast as butchers. One wrote home, "We were supposed to bring order, not ashes." For Frelimo, Wiriamu was both tragedy and opportunity. The movement invited journalists into its liberated zones to show the contrast. Classrooms built under trees, women carrying rifles beside men, a nation in waiting rising from the ruins. The world listened. Donations flowed, international recognition followed, and the moral high ground shifted irreversibly. Lisbon's diplomats scrambled to contain the fallout. They called the massacre a lie, a distortion, a trick of propaganda. But even within the regime, cracks appeared. Younger officers who had served in the field no longer believed their commanders. They had seen too much: villages emptied, children starved, friends lost to malaria and ambushes, and they knew the empire was collapsing from within. Caetano's speeches grew brittle, his tone detached. "Portugal is not a country of murderers," he said. But the world had stopped listening, and even within his own army, belief had evaporated. The Wiriamu revelations did what years of war could not. They destroyed the moral armor of the Estado Novo. For decades, the regime had told its people they were on a sacred mission, bringing light to the dark corners of the earth. But when the light finally reached Wiriamu, it illuminated only smoke, ruin, and silence. The story of Portugal's empire was no longer written in victory reports or colonial hymns. It was written in the ashes of a village, and while the flames of Wiriamu faded, they lit another fire, far closer to home. In Lisbon, among the officers who read those headlines, a new thought began to take shape. The empire would not end in Africa, it would end in Portugal. By the early 1970s, Lisbon was running out of illusions, but not out of orders. The Estado Novo still believed that victory was possible if only the right general, the right operation, and the right will could be found. Out of this hope and desperation came Operation No Gordio, the Gordian Knot, the largest military campaign Portugal ever launched in Africa. It was meant to slice through the rebellion in Mozambique and prove that the empire still had teeth. In 1970, General Calça de Arriaga took command with absolute confidence. He was a man of calculation and pride, admired by NATO allies and trusted by Caetano. His plan was vast and modern. Helicopters, paratroopers, and artillery would descend on the guerrilla zones of northern Mozambique. The Air Force would bomb Frelimo bases into submission, and ground troops would sweep through to restore order. "We will cut the knot," he promised, "and end the war in one stroke." For weeks, the skies above Cabo Delgado thundered with explosions. Thousands of soldiers moved through the bush, setting fire to villages suspected of aiding Frelimo. Columns advanced by day and withdrew by night, convinced they were purging the rebellion once and for all. Lisbon's newspapers hailed the offensive as a triumph of discipline and technology. The regime broadcast victory reports over the radio, painting images of stability returning to Mozambique. But on the ground, the reality was different. The guerrillas did not fight in open battle. They dissolved into the landscape, crossed the border into Tanzania, and waited. Once the army moved on, they returned. Every road cleared became a road lost again. Every victory report was a mirage. The Gordian knot could not be cut because it was not made of rope. It was made of people. Colsa's strategy consumed resources on an industrial scale, but it changed nothing. Soldiers wrote home describing endless patrols, searing heat, and villages that looked the same after each operation, empty, burned, and silent. By the time the campaign ended, Portugal had destroyed forests, crops, and homes, but not Frelimo. The movement emerged more resilient, more organized, and more politically united than before. In Lisbon, Caetano declared the operation a success. He needed victory, even if only on paper. But within the army, the truth spread. There was no decisive battle to fight, no end in sight. Commanders began measuring success by casualty rates rather than territory. The soldiers called it the War of Circles, an endless motion that led nowhere. The cost was enormous. The empire's military budget consumed nearly half of Portugal's national spending. Each year, new waves of conscripts were sent to Africa, while factories and farms at home struggled without their labor. Families buried their sons in silence, unable to speak openly of what had happened. The war that was supposed to preserve Portugal's pride had begun to eat its soul. Internationally, even Portugal's allies had lost patience. The United States, embroiled in Vietnam, saw in Mozambique a familiar futility. Western diplomats privately called No Gordio a mirage of success. Only South Africa and Rhodesia, bound by fear of black liberation, continued to cooperate militarily with Lisbon. For Caulça de Arriaga, the campaign's failure was personal. He remained loyal, but in private he admitted that the enemy could not be beaten with conventional force. "We have reached the ceiling of power," he told his aides. "We can bomb every village and still lose the country." By 1972, the Estado Novo was fighting wars it could no longer afford for victories it could no longer define. Its generals measured time in deployments, its politicians in denials, and its soldiers in years lost to jungles and deserts. The Gordian knot had not been cut. It had tightened around the empire's throat. And as the smoke settled over Mozambique, Lisbon's leaders still did not see that the real battlefield was no longer in Africa. It was in their own country, waiting for the moment when the soldiers would turn their discipline inward and aim it home. While the jungles of Africa burned, Portugal itself lived in the shadow of denial. In Lisbon, life moved with the rhythm of routine. Church bells, ration lines, and state radio repeating the same songs of unity and faith. To the outside world, it was a peaceful European capital. But beneath the calm, the war had reached home in every family, every street, every silence. By the early 1970s, nearly 1 million Portuguese had been sent to fight in Africa, an enormous number for a country of just 9 million people. Every village had sons overseas. Mothers kept photographs beside candles. Fiancés waited for letters that often never arrived. Those who returned came home changed, older, quieter, haunted by memories they could not share. The Estado Novo called them heroes, but it gave them no words to describe what they had seen. The war had become a national burden. It drained Portugal's treasury, devoured its youth, and isolated it diplomatically. Half the national budget now went to the colonial wars, while wages stagnated and inflation crept higher. The factories of Porto and Lisbon lacked workers. The fields of the Alentejo lay untended. To escape conscription, thousands fled the country, crossing into France, Switzerland, and West Germany to find work. For the first time in centuries, the Portuguese were emigrating not to expand their empire, but to escape it. Censorship kept the public ignorant of the scale of the conflict, but not of its cost. Coffins returned quietly, marked as training accidents. Veterans gathered in bars, whispering of ambushes and fear. Some cursed the government, others defended it. Most just fell silent. The war had no heroes, only survivors. The regime still staged parades and speeches. Marcelo Caetano, Salazar's successor, appeared on balconies surrounded by banners declaring, "Portugal is one and indivisible." But even he knew the lie was fraying. Reports from Africa told of desertions, mutinies, and soldiers refusing orders. In the barracks, officers spoke in whispers of exhaustion. "We fight without hatred," one lieutenant wrote, "but also without faith." Among the younger generation of officers, the so-called captains, the sense of futility became unbearable. Many were university graduates drafted into command positions, forced to lead men in wars they no longer believed in. They saw the disparity between their sacrifices and the comfort of politicians in Lisbon. They watched as their comrades died for slogans about civilization that meant nothing in the mud. Abroad, Portugal was increasingly isolated. The United Nations condemned its refusal to decolonize. African nations broke ties. Even the Vatican expressed concern after the Wiriamu revelations. The empire that had once boasted of spreading Christianity now stood accused of crimes against humanity. Yet the Estado Novo pressed on, claiming Portugal was defending Western values against communism. It was a convenient illusion, one that masked fear with rhetoric. Behind closed doors, Caetano confided to his ministers that we cannot abandon Africa without abandoning ourselves. But the truth was already written in the faces of those who returned home in silence. The war had become a mirror, reflecting the regime's decay. The soldiers in the field were fighting ghosts. The politicians in Lisbon were ruling them. Between the two stood a growing fracture, the officers who had seen the empire's failure with their own eyes. They would soon become the authors of its final act. The Estado Novo had survived bombs, revolts, and scandals, but it could not survive disillusionment. The empire's walls were not broken by invasion. They were rotting from within, brick by brick, soldier by soldier. And when the moment came, it would not be rebellion from the colonies that ended it, but rebellion from the army sent to defend them. By 1973, the Portuguese army had become the strangest of instruments, disciplined, loyal, and quietly mutinous. It still fought across 3 continents, yet its soldiers no longer believed in the cause. The empire's greatest threat was no longer in Africa. It was growing inside the ranks of those sworn to protect it. The turning point began with bureaucracy. Young officers returning from the colonies discovered that university graduates who had avoided combat were being promoted faster than those who had fought. It was a small injustice, but it struck at the heart of a weary army. These officers had commanded men, buried friends, and now they saw their sacrifices reduced to paperwork. Resentment became unity. Unity became purpose. Among them were men like Otelo Saraiva de Carvalho, Salgueiro Maia, and Vasco Lourenço, captains hardened by years of war, yet still idealistic enough to believe in change. They gathered in secret, calling themselves the Movimento das Forças Armadas, or the Armed Forces Movement, MFA. What began as a protest against unfair promotions soon grew into something far greater, a plan to end the dictatorship itself. These were not revolutionaries in the traditional sense. They were soldiers who wanted to restore dignity to their army, to their country, to the people who had been silenced for 40 years. They met quietly in cafes, barracks, and private apartments, drafting a manifesto that blended military order with democratic ideals. Their oath was simple: we have served the empire. Now we will serve the nation. By late 1973, the cracks in the Estado Novo were spreading fast. In Africa, the wars dragged on without progress. At home, the economy faltered. Censorship stifled every voice, and even the church began to distance itself from the regime. Prime Minister Marcelo Caetano, once hailed as Salazar's modernizer, now looked like a man trapped in the past, too cautious to reform, too weak to suppress dissent. The spark came not from an ideology, but from exhaustion. Many MFA officers believed the only way to end the wars was to end the regime that demanded them. They saw the futility of continuing a struggle that cost thousands of lives and gained nothing. "We are fighting our own shadows," one captain wrote in his diary. "We kill in Africa to keep silence in Lisbon." The MFA began recruiting allies quietly, journalists, students, and even priests who sympathized with their cause. The goal was not chaos, but renewal. They wanted a revolution without blood, one that would replace dictatorship with democracy. Planning intensified under secrecy, using coded messages and covert meetings. And then, in the early months of 1974, something remarkable happened. Songs banned from the radio began circulating on cassette tapes, soft, melancholic tunes that spoke of freedom without saying the word. Among them was a song called Grandola Vila Morena. It was a poem about brotherhood and equality, its rhythm simple, its meaning unmistakable. The MFA decided that when that song was played on the radio, it would be their signal. By April, the conspirators were ready. They were not rebels storming a fortress. They were the fortress itself. Hundreds of officers across Portugal's garrisons were prepared to act. When the hour came, it would not begin with gunfire or shouting. It would begin with music. The soldiers who had fought for empire were about to fight for their own souls. The war in Africa had broken their faith in conquest. Now it would awaken their belief in freedom. The empire's armies were turning homeward, and history was about to hear the sound of its own undoing. It began quietly, without speeches or fanfare, just music on the radio. At 12:20 a.m., April 25, 1974, Lisbon's airwaves carried a familiar melody, Grandola Vila Morena. To most listeners, it was a sentimental folk song. But to those in uniform who had waited months for this moment, it was the signal, the beginning of a revolution. Across the country, military units stirred from their barracks. Tanks rolled through the narrow streets of Lisbon, headlights dimmed. Soldiers took positions at radio stations, ministries, and airports. The Movimento das Forças Armadas, MFA, was in motion, disciplined, coordinated, and astonishingly calm. Orders were clear. No bloodshed, no revenge, no chaos. Only the necessary, said Otelo Saraiva de Carvalho, the strategist of the operation. By dawn, the Portuguese capital was under military control. Civilians woke to the rumble of armored vehicles and the sound of soldiers giving directions politely, almost shyly. People gathered in the streets, unsure whether to fear or to hope. Then something extraordinary happened. A woman selling flowers approached a group of soldiers and placed red carnations into their rifle barrels. Others followed. Within hours, Lisbon bloomed red. There were no barricades, no executions, no firing squads. The city moved in slow harmony. Shopkeepers bringing water to troops, children waving flags, priests blessing the crowds. Tanks parked beneath the balconies of government buildings, their turrets silent but unyielding. The dictatorship that had ruled Portugal for nearly half a century was collapsing, not under bombardment, but under its own silence. At the Carmelite barracks, Prime Minister Marcelo Caetano refused to surrender to just anyone. He demanded to hand power to a general, not a captain. Hours of tense negotiation followed until General Antonio de Spinola, a decorated veteran of the colonial wars and a respected critic of the regime, agreed to receive his resignation. When Caetano finally stepped down, the crowd outside erupted, not with rage, but with tears. That afternoon, Spinola addressed the nation. His voice was firm, but weary. The armed forces movement has taken power to restore democracy, to end censorship, and to end the war in Africa. No propaganda, no rhetoric, just relief. Across the colonies, the shock was immediate. Commanders in Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea received radio transmissions with disbelief. Some refused to believe Lisbon had fallen. Others cheered. For the soldiers in the streets of Lisbon, the day passed in a surreal calm. Civilians embraced them, offering food and flowers. The scent of carnations mixed with the smell of diesel and dust. By evening, the dictatorship was gone. The Estado Novo, which had survived wars, isolation, and rebellion, had finally been undone by its own army, by men who had seen too much to keep obeying. Foreign correspondents called it a miracle. Others called it the revolution of the gentle. But to those who lived it, it was something even more profound, a release. The fear that had gripped Portugal for 40 years dissolved in a single day. People sang in the streets until midnight, voices trembling with disbelief. As the sun set over the Tagus River, its reflection glowed crimson, not with blood, but with flowers. A quiet nation had rediscovered its voice. And in that moment, as soldiers smiled through exhaustion and crowds filled the plazas, the empire's long twilight ended, not in battle, but in a song. The fall of Lisbon's dictatorship echoed across the empire like the crack of a breaking chain. In Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau, Portuguese officers stared at their radios in disbelief. Some tore insignias from their uniforms, others simply sat in silence. The empire they had bled to defend no longer existed. A new government, the Junta of National Salvation, had taken power and promised what the old regime had forbidden: peace and decolonization. Within weeks, Lisbon began withdrawing troops. Commanders who had once sworn never to abandon Africa now negotiated ceasefires with the very guerrillas they had hunted. Planes filled with weary soldiers lifted off from Luanda and Maputo, leaving behind bases overgrown with vines and bullet holes. For many, the war ended not with victory or surrender, but with confusion. "We fought to keep a nation together," one captain wrote, and returned to find it already gone. In Guinea-Bissau, independence, declared a year earlier by the Pags, was formally recognized. The new flag rose above Bissau's fortress as the last Portuguese garrison boarded ships home. In Mozambique, Frelimo, led by Samora Machel, signed the Lusaka Accord in September 1974, establishing a transitional government. Crowds filled the streets, singing songs of freedom mixed with mourning. For them, independence came not as triumph, but as release from decades of exhaustion. In Angola, however, liberation gave way to chaos. The three main factions, the MPLA, FNLA, and UNITA, turned their guns on each other, each claiming to represent the nation's future. Foreign powers rushed in. Cuba and the Soviet Union backed the MPLA. The United States and South Africa supported the FNLA and UNITA. The land that had been the empire's crown jewel became the battleground for a new kind of war, a civil war fought in the ashes of colonialism. For Portugal, the retreat was painful and chaotic. Nearly 500,000 settlers, known as retornados, fled the colonies, bringing what little they could carry. They filled Lisbon's ports and airports, farmers, shopkeepers, civil servants, suddenly homeless in the country they had once ruled. Apartments overflowed, jobs vanished, and resentment simmered. "We left everything," one woman said, "even the graves. Yet amid the grief, there was also renewal. For the first time in centuries, Portugal looked inward instead of outward. The empire had been both its pride and its prison. Without it, the nation could finally breathe, though it did not yet know how." The new government, fragile and uncertain, struggled to stabilize democracy while managing the unraveling of centuries-old possessions. The negotiations that followed were messy, uneven, sometimes desperate, but they marked something unprecedented in Portugal's history: a peaceful dismantling of empire. Treaties replaced decrees, handshakes replaced gunfire. In less than a year, the flag of the Estado Novo vanished from Africa, replaced by the banners of nations born from its ruins. The untying of the empire was not clean. It was tangled with betrayal, exile, and blood. But for Portugal, it was also liberation from the weight of its own mythology. The belief that a small nation could rule half the world had ended. What remained was a chance to become whole again, not as a conqueror, but as a democracy. By 1975, the guns had fallen silent. The colonial wars were over, but peace, like freedom, would not come easily. The ghosts of empire still walked through Lisbon's streets, in memories, in photographs, in the eyes of men who had fought for something they no longer understood. The world turned a page. Portugal had come home. When the dust of revolution settled, Portugal was free, but fractured. The Estado Novo had fallen, the colonies were gone, yet the aftershocks of empire rippled through every corner of society. The war had ended, but its ghosts refused to fade. In the new republic, soldiers returned not as heroes, but as reminders of a painful past. Many were met with silence, not celebration. They wandered through Lisbon's narrow streets, carrying memories no one wanted to hear: ambushes in Angola, burned villages in Mozambique, the smell of napalm in Guinea. The country had moved on, but the men who fought for it could not. "We came home," one veteran said, "but there was no home left for us." The retornados, those 500,000 settlers who fled Africa, crowded into hastily built housing projects along the outskirts of Lisbon and Porto. They had lost everything: homes, land, identity. and now faced suspicion from their own countrymen. Some tried to rebuild lives in silence, others lived in bitterness, unable to reconcile what had been taken. The empire had promised them belonging, independence had left them stranded. Meanwhile, in Africa, the newly born nations faced the impossible task of building stability out of ashes. Angola plunged into civil war before the ink on its independence documents had dried. Soviet advisors arrived in Luanda. Cuban soldiers soon followed. South African troops crossed the border in the name of containment. The conflict that began as a war of liberation became one of ideology and proxy. In Mozambique, Frelimo's dream of unity quickly met reality. Poverty, drought, and foreign interference fueled discontent. By the late 1970s, Renamo, a rebel group backed by Rhodesia and later South Africa, ignited another long and bloody civil war. The fields that once bore cotton for Lisbon now became killing grounds for rival visions of freedom. Guinea-Bissau, the smallest and poorest of Portugal's former colonies, was crippled by infighting and coup. The ideals of Amilcar Cabral, education, unity, equality, faded under the weight of corruption and poverty. Across Africa, the dream of liberation had triumphed, but peace remained elusive. And yet, amid the chaos, something enduring took root. Portugal's departure, though painful, allowed these nations to begin defining themselves. For the first time in centuries, they were no longer the periphery of someone else's world, they were their own. Back in Lisbon, democracy took shape from the ruins. The new Constitution of 1976 enshrined freedom of speech, press, and political pluralism. The secret police were disbanded, censorship abolished, and elections held. For the first time in living memory, Portugal belonged to its people. But the wounds of empire ran deep. The economy struggled, inflation soared, and the military, once the instrument of dictatorship, now had to defend democracy. The country joined the European Economic Community in the 1980s, seeking not colonies abroad, but partnership at home. Slowly, the nation redefined its identity, not as a ruler of seas, but as part of Europe. As decades passed, the memory of empire softened into nostalgia. Old veterans told their stories to grandchildren. Faded photographs hung in living rooms. The names of faraway places, Luanda, Lourenço Marques, Bissau, lingered like fragments of a forgotten language. But beneath the nostalgia lay a quieter truth. Portugal's empire had not ended in defeat. It had ended in awakening. An awakening to the cost of pride, to the illusion of permanence, and to the simple reality that no empire, however ancient, can escape time. The morning light still falls over the Tagus River, as it did in the beginning of this story. The water glows gold, calm, indifferent. It reflects not the sails of caravels or the shadows of conquest, but a smaller, freer Portugal, finally at peace with its size, its history, and itself.